According to Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton, the team has a good problem as it pertains to roster building at the wide receiver position. Why does Sean Payton think this is the deepest wide receiver group he's seen in quite some time? We'll analyze that and maybe the outlook of how it shakes out here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, covering the team up close and personal every day in Dove Valley, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, the longtime site expert and voice for Broncos Country over there, predominantlyorange.com. And really on today's episode of the show, Broncos Country, as we go deeper into the final week of training camp, Sean Payton says he looks at his roster paper. There are potentially 44 spots right now he looks at as potentially locked up. What does it mean for those other 9 remaining spots? We get some insight here from Sean Payton. He also shared some insight as we got to watch practice as well on Wednesday, talking about situational elements that he really wants his team to hone in on this season. And the Broncos have a little bit of a dilemma, a good dilemma on their hands at the wide receiver position. So many players, so many names, and only a few spots that are up for grabs. How does that play out? As Payton calls it, the deepest group he's seen in quite some time. You'll get that here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. For all you everydayers, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day. You can get the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for rocking with us here, Broncos Country. Sayre, let's open things up here. Obviously, the Broncos returned to practice on Wednesday at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. And really coming into practice, the emphasis was shells. They just came off of a game on Sunday. They want to get guys to a point because it's going to be physical the next couple of days. You have a Thursday practice, then you have a joint practice with the Green Bay Packers before you play on Sunday. Sean Payton, you and I were talking off air a little bit, and I think even in messaging just about Denver's wide receiver group, and I saw you put a tweet out earlier in the day just about that, and I responded in terms of how many receivers the Broncos keep. And look, it felt like it would be a great point to ask Sean Payton what he's seen from that competition because it is deep and it is healthy. He seemed to agree.
Yeah, he did. And it's been impressive to watch these guys compete. One day we're talking about Devon Vele. The next day we're talking about, I don't know, David Sills the fifth. It could be Lil Jordan Humphrey. It could be Brandon Johnson. It could be Jalen Virgil. And it's just nice Josh Reynolds, certainly another guy that's gotten a lot of positive hype at training camp this year. It's a nice problem to have. The Denver Broncos, I wouldn't say they necessarily have, and somebody responded to that tweet that you mentioned, Cody, is saying the Broncos have the least dynamic wide receiver room in the league. And I get what you're saying. I think there's not necessarily this, murderer's row of yak players. We're not the San Francisco 49ers by any means, but I do think there's a lot of really good qualities to this wide receiver room. A lot of guys that do a number of different things well, despite having pretty similar body types. And it is a deep group. And we saw in the preseason game, anything is on the table at this point. Marvin Mims playing deep into the game. David Sills was listed amongst the starters. So I just don't know exactly how it's going to all play out, Cody. I think that's why the question kind of got brought up in the first place, is because right now, if you say there's 6 or 7 roster spots and 7 would be like the stretch, that's a lot of wide receivers to keep on a roster. If you're saying there's that many spots available, even if you do say there's 7, you get probably 10 different responses from 10 different people. If you ask which 7 are the Broncos going to keep?
Yeah, and look, obviously there's a lot of interpretations. I know a lot of fans have their own personal favorites. I just think just by watching this competition brew throughout OTAs, the start of training camp, and even in the first preseason game, this is going to be a tough decision. Like the Broncos, and that's why I asked Sean, I said, what are you looking at specifically when you're looking at this wide receiver room, healthy competition? And what are you looking for that's going to be the criteria that maybe grants those back end spots? Here's what Sean had to say.
Yesterday, we spent a lot of time on personnel. Sometimes the nod is kicking game related. Sometimes the nod might be experience. There's a lot that goes into it. And I agree with your first statement. More than I can recall anywhere, the depth and competition at that position group. I think we potentially have guys that may end up playing for another team, and so, but it's still early in the process. But I think it's a real good question, and it's a reality of, just this camp right now, and these guys are working hard, and it's a good problem to have.
It is a good problem to have, and it is technically, I guess, early in the process, Cody, but according to my watch right here, we're about 3 weeks out from the start of the regular season, right? And we're less than 3 weeks away from having to finalize these rosters. And so I think this coming weekend is going to be huge with the Broncos joint practice against the Packers, the preseason game against Green Bay, and getting to see Bo Nix in there with the number 1 units, Jarrett Stidham working with, I assume, the 2s, and Zach Wilson with the 3s there. I think that we're going to see separation. And I think that's, appropriate with this being a wide receiver discussion, right? We're going to see these guys, somebody's going to separate themselves. And after the first preseason game, it's tough to know because right now you've got a lot of these people, and I don't know where these reports originated, Cody, but you've got a lot of people right now talking about, well, Troy Franklin could be a cut candidate because he's been such a disappointment in training camp. And then the roster builder in me is like, I don't know how you could, that's roster malpractice. You traded up for the guy. You spoke out loud that you have a 2nd round grade on the guy. I know that practice carries value. Preseason games carry value, but there's also the future years of this team that carry value, right? And Sean Payton just said it. The kicking game could be it. Experience could be it. There's so many different aspects to this, but ultimately, I think what he said about somebody's going to be playing probably for a different team, if not multiple players at this position. That's just kind of the situation the Broncos are in. So we are getting close. Even though he says we're early in the process, I think we're getting really close to some trades being formulated.
I mean, I think that's certainly a possibility. And look, it could be even other positions besides wide receiver that end up getting traded. I mean, we're monitoring the Minnesota Vikings quarterback situation there as to what's happening there. Check out Locked On Vikings for more on Luke Braun on the news of JJ McCarthy. Rough hand dealt for them. But, speak like to this point about your Troy Franklin statement. Like I would say Troy definitely has had some struggles, right? But Sean has already been on the record of saying that sometimes it takes a wide receiver a couple of years to get to where you need to be. And right now, Denver's in a position they don't need Troy Franklin to be some special world beater right now. Like he's moldable. He obviously has speed. His main elements that have been a concern have been drops. And he had a really bad drop. Zach Wilson threw him a dime down the sideline. It would have been a touchdown. Dropped it. Like those are things that Troy's going to have to overcome and obviously get better at. You don't risk cutting him because he could end up on someone else's team. There's right now, you look at it like the kicking game, Sayre, Devon Vele is going to play a lot of special teams here for Denver and wide receiver. Like Devon Vele, I think it's safe to say is further ahead than Troy Franklin. And look, that's not like, okay, Troy Franklin is going to be this terrible player. No, like Troy's just in a different spot. People forget Devon Vele is 26 going on 27. He's a little bit more experienced in some areas. He certainly doesn't look like a rookie. Sean gave that nod there. But I'm saying, like, yes, even though Troy has struggled, you don't move on from Troy right now. And I think we had the conversation. I think Denver keeps 7 wide receivers here, right? I think it's going to be Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Marvin Mims, Josh Reynolds, Devon Vele, Troy Franklin. And then I think Jalen Virgil, because the fact that Jalen Virgil is a core 4 special teams guy, a gunner, a jammer, kick coverage. We saw him in the return game, and he can be an underrated receiver for the Broncos and what they want to achieve as well. He's big. Like he's bigger than he was in his first couple of seasons. So for me, that is like, okay, now where do you play roster gymnastics elsewhere? Like that's how I think it's going to go. But I also think you're in a position you have to ask yourself the question. I think you put this out nicely inside the group chat is, can you live without one of these guys? I guarantee you a good portion of these guys will more than likely end up back on the team's practice squad. David Sills, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Michael Bandy, Brandon Johnson may not be one of those guys, unfortunately. He may actually get one of those shots on another NFL team, so something to keep an eye on there. But look, Broncos Country, we learned a lot from Sean Payton in Wednesday's press conference, setting things up for the Green Bay Packers joint practice here on Friday. The team's going to be back on the field on Thursday. But really, Wednesday's practice, while it was light with shells, the tempo was high, but there was a lot of educational emphasis on situationals. We'll hear from Broncos head coach Sean Payton on the attention to details that he believes will help them win the game here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel, and we all love sports. If you're listening to this show, you love sports too, and we never want them to stop. And you know what? The off season for the NFL, it's almost finally over, right? We're in the preseason right now, and even though they're not real games, sports, before this, they were not sportsing like we wanted them to, right? But FanDuel, even in the NFL off season and even in the preseason, FanDuel lets us keep the sports going whenever we want. All you got to do is open up the FanDuel app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So if you want to check out what is that line moving on the Broncos at 5.5 wins this year, you still want to hit the over on that, or maybe you want to check out some Bo Nix rookie season props, maybe take a look at his rookie of the year odds right now, head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. How can a young Denver Broncos team maybe outkick their coverage in 2024? Focusing on the details and being ready in every situation. That's why at training camp, it sounds like the Broncos have gone through a lot of different specific situations so that they're not thrown off by anything that comes their way. Even as a young team, they can be ready to go in clutch moments. We're going to talk about that on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. But Broncos Country, I want to say thank you so much for joining your boys, Cody and Sayre, every single day here on Locked on Broncos. We appreciate you so much for subscribing to the show wherever you get your podcasts, as well as going over to YouTube, where we're on the road to 15K subscribers. You've been there through every milestone so far, so help us continue to get to the next one. And if you haven't already, for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football. I know those drafts are coming up, Cody. I've got one on the 16th upcoming here, so that's my only one. I've been in the same league for years, and I still stink at fantasy football, so I need Locked On Fantasy Football to help me out with that draft. And speaking of help, I think a young team is going to be helped tremendously by practicing situational football, focusing on the details. It's less, it sounds like, about fundamentals to me, Cody, and a lot more of when you're a young team and let's just go straight to week 2. You're playing at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's a 2-minute drill. You're going up against one of the best defenses in the league. You have to be ready for any situation that gets thrown your way. It sounds like Sean Payton and his staff are putting this young team through a lot of different situations so far at training camp.
Yeah, he is, and he's doing a really good job. And I think the unfortunate part of our conversation that we're going to have here is I can't share the details in which what Sean was teaching about to a T, right? But it's basically like philosophy, end of half, philosophy, end of game. And right, let's say it's, okay, end of game situation, you're down 6, you need a touchdown. Or, hey, it's end of game, you're down 3, you need a field goal to tie. How do you maneuver about that, especially if you have no timeouts? Like, Sean really emphasized his vision and his philosophy on what he wants to see from the quarterback and the receivers and the landmarks where he wants them to be in a situation like that, considering they don't have timeouts, right? I can't go too far in the weeds there. That's about as deep as I can get on that. But he said that this is the reason why we do it. And then if you get into a situation where the clock is stopped and your look, let's say you're getting closer, your look isn't there, he went deeper into why he wants the quarterback to maybe throw the ball out of bounds in a situation, or to maybe tuck run, try to get outside to the sideline to, stop the clock. Like, there's intricacies to it. There were some things that he was going over just in today's game, just about his philosophy on if we have zone coverage, this is what I want us to attack. If we have man coverage, this is what I want us to look at. And here's where our adjustment is. That's about as deep as in the weeds I can go on that without, getting in trouble here. So I just think that the situational emphasis, and we heard him talk about it a little bit after practice, like, there's different cut-ups, there's different situations. And I think Denver found one too, because remember, I think the biggest critique that we saw going into halftime was, well, how come the Broncos didn't try to give Bo Nix one more shot into the end zone? Well, the reason and thinking behind that is, okay, hey, we're in a position to score points. Let's kick the field goal, get 3 points. You want to know why? Because we were getting the ball back after halftime, right? So let's say hypothetically, you decide 7 seconds left, you try to take a shot in the end zone. It's tipped up in the air, intercepted. Well, now you lose out on 3 points, even though you're going to get the ball back after half. You want to be able to play the points game. And look, in a game where the Broncos had as many turnovers as they did, they had a estimated fumble return for a touchdown. that could have been a huge difference maker in the potential outcome of the game if, let's say, Denver threw an interception with 7 seconds left and didn't come away with points out of halftime. So there's always a rhyme and a reason. And look, that's why I love football. Sayre, it's so complicated. But instead of me explaining it further, I'll let Sean explain a little bit of insight as to what his plan was for Wednesday's practice.
There's over 500 2-minute situations, and the first thing is when the drill starts, I think it's helpful if they know advantage who. If I put the ball on the 30 with 28 seconds left, need a touchdown, 1 timeout, advantage defense. So let's not have, in other words, we're going to defend that way to some degree. Now, if I put the ball on the 40, like I did today, I didn't give many timeouts, and they needed a field goal. Analytically speaking, it would probably be down the middle, maybe tilted a little towards the offense.
What I like about the situational stuff that we heard about from practice today, Cody, as well as during the game, what you just mentioned made me think about this too. When you're the offense, you're going down, you take those 3 points as opposed to going at the end zone one more time and risking running out the clock, risking a turnover, things like that. If you know you're getting the ball after halftime and you have a chance to put up 3 points, you have to now think about the field position game as well, because in what we're seeing with the kickoffs, we mentioned this with Jalen Virgil specifically, but you could point to any number of guys. You're averaging around 30 yards a return, and you're catching the ball on average probably at the 5-yard line in that landing zone there. You're not only talking about going into halftime with 3 points, but you're also talking about being within about 20, 25 yards of being in field goal range already once again, just immediately after the half. So it's an interesting new sort of wrinkle to throw in about, well, it's not necessarily about being aggressive versus being conservative. It's about playing the analytics game of saying, will we get this starting field position coming out of half? And let's say we're starting at the 30 or the 35 or better. We're going to have a really good chance of being able to pace ourselves and go up by, have a 10-point swing here as opposed to a 7-point swing or a 6-point swing or 0, So I like that strategic thinking. And I think the new kickoff game really does change these scenarios, those 500 scenarios that he's talking about there. I think the kickoff coming out of half does change. And if let's just say you're coming out of the half, you're kicking the ball away, you may go for the touchdown at that point because they're getting the ball. They're probably going to have decent field position. And so we need to get the 7 points here. So I don't know. I find that all kind of just fascinating to add that wrinkle into the mix.
Well, let's even do a little bit of a history lesson here. Unfortunately, it has to involve with Zach Wilson. Like, remember last year when the Jets came to town to play the Broncos? Remember right before halftime, Zach Wilson kind of made one of those mistakes. They didn't have timeouts. The ball didn't go out of bounds and it stayed inbounds. They ran out of time right before halftime. Luckily for them, they got the ball coming out of half, and Breece Hall ran for, I think, 70 yards against Denver's defense on that, very first play of the second half. So, they missed out on a potential 10-point swing there in that situation there. And it's just like, you never want to go into a halftime. You never want to go into any situation where you can come away with points and you have a missed opportunity because time runs out in a situation like that end of half. So I think the attention to detail and really what Sean talked about that I like is that he's trying to get the players to think like he's thinking, like, hey, be aware, like this situation, this is what I'm thinking, like be aware of that. He mentioned the where they got the Indianapolis Colts to jump, right? And it was a 5-yard penalty, but it was an automatic first down. And he said he turned and yelled at DJ Jones and the defensive lineman about, like, from a teaching standpoint, like, this is something that, we all need to pay attention. We need to be aware of. I love that about him. And just, I would say this, watching Sean coach, I learn a lot, but like when they're closer to us, you get to hear it. You get to see it a little bit more in depth than normally you ever would. So there's a lot of attention to detail, situational football. And that's why I think Denver was able last year to execute what he calls hurricane twice against the Buffalo Bills, end of half, end of game. And he even talked about that. That situation doesn't come up often. And they ran into it twice in one game. They nailed it. So just things you want to continue to build on, and I think this is important too. When you have a young roster the way Denver does, you want everyone to be mentally sharp. And that can be the difference between you losing 2 or 3 games or winning 4 or 5. And the Broncos from last season would probably, say like, hey, I agree. He has a point. And so there's a lot to build off of there as the team continues their preparation for the regular season, 2.5 weeks away. Roster cuts coming up, but 2 more preseason games are here. Now, as we look at roster cuts coming up, Sean Payton looked at his handy dandy paper notebook and said, I could look at it and say, maybe, 44 spots are here. What are the final 9? What's the criteria that Sean's looking for to building those final back end spots of the roster? We'll hear from him and dive a little bit deeper tonight here on today's episode of the show.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. And it's helpful when you get therapy to learn positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who have experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we'll learn a little bit about Sean Payton's mindset when it comes to roster building, when it comes to the factors of determining those final spots, especially if he already has 44 spots on the roster locked up in his head right now. What does he need for those final 9 spots? That's what you're going to get here on today's show. Just want to say thanks once again, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making us your first listen, becoming an everydayer to make the show exactly what it is. Locked On Broncos, we appreciate you so much there. Sayre, obviously some more insight, some more learning here from Sean Payton. I felt like Wednesday's press conference, we got a lot of insight into maybe some of the team building, the philosophy, the coaching belief as to what he wants his coaches to do, how he wants his players to respond. And then just going back to the whole team building aspect, he had a lot to say about like the types of roster discussions. I found it interesting, and I don't know if he's being tongue in cheek, but he said, I look at my paper and there's 44 players, which means, okay, who are going to be those final 9 players on the 53 and those spots that are up for grab? I mean, it certainly presents an interesting dilemma here with 2 preseason games remaining. I wish I knew who those back end 9 players were as well.
I do too. I wish I knew even just general position areas that they were looking at, and I think that that's certainly going to be something that we have to watch closely in this Packers game, because as we saw last year in the third and final preseason game, like Albert Okwuegbunam went out, had the game of his life basically against the Los Angeles Rams, and still ended up getting traded. He wasn't part of the plan. So I think that after this Packers game, we should maybe have our best indicator of who is part of the plan. Now, that's not to say the third preseason game was meaningless by any means. I think it's going to be part of the equation. But I do think that after this weekend, we're going to have maybe our clearest indicator, because he even also talked about the fact of, they're trying to get looks at certain guys deeper into these games and at practices as well, who may be among the 9, right? And so I think, are we trying to kind of read into maybe guys who are on the roster bubble at this stage? I don't know. So I think that there's going to be a lot of discussion after this, the joint practice, the preseason game against the Packers. And if Sean's got 44 guys in mind, 9 open spots, that's quite a few. So, I mean, definitely the competition between, we know there's going to be 16 guys on the practice squad, right? So there's a lot of healthy competition for this team right now going into this big pivotal week against the Packers.
Look, there's some of those decisions that are easy and that we've made, that, in other words, I can tell you who the right guard's going to be. That's easy. All right. But I think we're having those discussions. I'll ask the question constantly in the staff meeting. If we're playing tomorrow, how do you see it? And if we're playing tomorrow, how do you see the final receiver cut down? If we're playing tomorrow, how do you see? We discuss those things.
And look, I think that you have to have those discussions. Like, can you live without this guy? Is this a guy that we're absolutely going to need? We've heard Sean rave about the notion that, hey, you need to build the right 53. We don't want a guy in our building that is going to go on and have success elsewhere when we had him here. And he could have had success with us in terms of offense or defense. But also I think he goes a little bit deeper in terms of this when he talks about really building the 53 and some of that criteria. Here's what he had to say.
at 53, you'd say realistically we might be on my paper up there 44, and then this next 9. That's realistic at where we're at, and barring injury or things that can happen. So I think we're always talking about it, and then we're not afraid. Like, there's certain players that, look, I know exactly what I'm getting. I've seen it. Let's make sure we get more from this guy, because I know the evaluation I have on the other guy. And so trying to get those reps, trying to get those snaps with the right groups for guys that are part of that mix in competition, we spend a lot of time on that.
So I think of like Nate Adkins, Cody, getting reps, and because Sean Payton knows what he's getting from Michael Burton. You think of Devon Vele and, David Sills getting reps because Sean Payton knows this. I know what I'm getting from Lil Jordan Humphrey on game day. And that's what you have to beat out on this roster, is what I know that I'm getting from him. So Devon Vele could push somebody like Lil Jordan Humphrey off the roster, even though Lil Jordan could end up on the practice squad and still contributing on game days. So there's just all these different, like you said earlier, gymnastics that you end up having to do, because you have to figure out getting to the right 53. It's not just about, all right, who's going to be the best group to have against Seattle? Because if you've already got 44 spots figured out, there's only 2 more game day active spots, right? And that could come from the practice squad, reasonably speaking. So I just think right now you're getting to those 9 guys. Out of those 9, 5, 6, 7 of those guys could end up being developmental players. Like we talked about Ioma Uwazurike. We've talked about Troy Franklin. You look at somebody like maybe a Dondre Tillman. You could look at, any number of safeties back there if there's somebody that's stepping up. It could be a linebacker like Lavelle Bailey. I don't know who exactly. Could be an offensive lineman, maybe a tight end. But what I do know is that whatever roster gymnastics you end up having to do, it's going to cost you somewhere else. It's going to require probably some unpopular decisions at certain places on this roster.
And that's the gamble of, the 90-man roster. And look, could you imagine how I feel like it'd be easier for us to kind of fill out if it was like the old days where after the first preseason game, you have to cut down from this number. What is it? 80. It used to be 85 to 80, or it was 90 to 85. And then the second game, 85 to 80. And then you go from 80 to 53 after that third and final preseason game. I like that it's now like you can wait till after that final preseason game to do it. So I think, what should Broncos fans read into? Like, Sayre, you get the game book, right, from NFL GSIS. The one thing I would say after the game, let's read into how many snaps, like who played the most snaps overall on offense, who played the most snaps defense, that are at positions that aren't necessarily locked in starters or, locked in depth guys just yet, but guys that are in competition for a roster spot. To me, that'll be a big telling sign here in the next couple of weeks as we go about, breaking down what's going on here. And obviously, look, there's going to be so much happening this week. I think for fans at training camp, I was surprised. School started up here again, Sayre, and I was surprised to see so many people at training camp today, because aren't your kids in school? Aren't they supposed to be in school? But if you're missing school to go see some practice, I can't fault that. I would have loved to be in that position as a kid myself. But there's so much going on. Thursday's practice, obviously, tomorrow is going to be something they're going to emphasize. Kind of just, hey, we need to ramp it up a little bit. And look, the goal is to try to get to Friday healthy, because Friday is going to feature a lot of physical competition, because that's the only time the Broncos starters essentially are going to face Green Bay's starters, because Matt LaFleur's already said that they don't plan to play much of their starters, maybe any of their starters in that game, as Bo Nix gets his first start. And look, I think Sean reflected on a lot of stuff. Some quick housekeeping notes here. Art Green is one player. He's obviously going through some mild symptoms in the concussion protocol right now. Won't play this week, more than likely, as Sean said. Lucas Kroll said, hopefully we see him back out there on Thursday with the toe injury. When you say you got a toe, I don't know what that means. But Brandon Jones doing a little bit more. And then maybe Levi Wallace maybe returns to the shelf, off the shelf this week. That's going to be huge to get some of these guys back if that's the case.
Yeah, it is, especially Brandon Jones. I think we really need to see Brandon Jones out there making plays. I know there's got to be probably an acclimation period or ramp up period for him, but replacing Justin Simmons, I don't know. That's a big responsibility. I'm not saying he's going to be able to go out there and get 6-7 interceptions this year, but certainly Brandon Jones has a lot of pressure on him based on the fact that he was your probably number one priority in free agency. We haven't seen much of anything from him yet this year, as you know, Broncos fandom hasn't. So him going out there making plays is going to be absolutely huge. And there's other like that defensive backfield going up against Green Bay's receiver group. It's going to be that's going to be the focus, Cody. I know you already love watching the DBs in general, but man, seeing them go up against the Packers, they have so much talent. Dontavian Wick's going to have a big year for them. Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Romeo Dobbs, as we've mentioned before. They've got plenty of other guys, Malik Heath, Bo Melton, Grant DuBose. Those guys going up against Denver's defensive backfield. If you're out at joint practice, watch the wide receivers of Green Bay versus the DBs of the Denver Broncos. That's going to be huge this coming weekend.
Now, you know what else is going to be huge this coming weekend? Staying up to date with the Locked On Broncos podcast for the next couple of days following joint practice and also Thursday's practice. We got you covered. But you know what? We also have game previews, keys to victory, players to watch. And then guess what? On Sunday after the game, you get an immediate Locked On Broncos post-game report, courtesy Sayre Bedinger, myself. For all you everydayers out there, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. We'll recap Thursday's practice, some of the biggest storylines coming out of it. We'll monitor some of the injury updates on some of the players who we anticipate maybe coming back to practice, guys who may not be at practice as well. We'll analyze that and much more. And for your second listen of the day, make sure you go check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast to help you prepare for your leagues this season. Go win your league. Get the expert advice there. Locked On Fantasy Football, wherever you get your podcasts or available on YouTube. With that said, Sayre and myself, we will see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.